The last train of the night pulled away from Elbridge Station at precisely 11:04 p.m. on March 22, 1994. The small platform, dimly lit and flanked by rusted fencing, was silent by the time the red glow of the rear lights vanished down the tracks. In the chill of early spring, the only remaining sound was a low whistle of wind moving through abandoned grain silos just east of the platform. Somewhere nearby, a man named Peter Mallory stood alone. He had missed the train. At 42, Peter was known by friends and neighbors as methodical, responsible, maybe even a little too cautious. He worked as a purchasing manager for an industrial supplier based in Springfield and commuted to Chicago twice a month for meetings. He was punctual, predictable, and on the evening of March 22nd, he had called his wife from a payphone on the platform. The call lasted less than a minute. He told her calmly that he'd missed the last outbound train home. He said not to worry, that he'd find a taxi or maybe get a room for the night. Then he said goodbye. He never made it home. The following morning, his wife, Claire, began calling around. She checked local motels, taxi services, even hospitals. When there was no word by that afternoon, she filed a missing person report. Police visited Elbridge Station but found nothing unusual. The attendant on duty had already gone home by the time Peter made the call. The security footage system installed at the time was spotty. Footage of that night was missing due to a known recording error, noted 2 days later in a maintenance log. What followed was a cold, hard silence. His car remained parked at the Springfield depot. His bank account sat untouched. No one reported seeing him. No clothing or personal effects were recovered. The phone card he'd used showed no further activity. And in a time before smartphones and GPS tracking, there were no breadcrumbs to follow. Peter Mallory was simply gone. Over the years, the case slipped deeper into obscurity. There were theories, of course. Maybe he'd been picked up by a stranger. Maybe he'd suffered a breakdown. Some believe he had chosen to disappear, though his stable life and spotless history gave little weight to that idea. Claire kept his belongings, hoping anything would one day surface. But nothing did. By 2002, the rail station had been remodeled. The old grain silos were demolished, and just past the wooded edge of the station, a crumbling red brick factory, once used for small engine parts, was condemned and boarded up. The area quieted. Life moved on, until 28 years later. In the spring of 2022, a technology firm based out of Minneapolis purchased the defunct factory site with plans to renovate it into a data center. The building had been sealed since the late 1980s and was reportedly empty. No utilities, no activity. It was a shell. But as the crew began clearing debris from the interior, they found something strange. Along the eastern wall of the second floor, beneath layers of warped plywood, was a brick partition that didn't match the original layout. Behind it, sealed and forgotten, was a room. The door had no handle. It had been bolted from the outside and painted to match the wall. When they broke it open, they found furniture, an old metal desk, 2 filing cabinets, a rotary phone, and an oil heater. On the walls were yellowed calendars from 1994. Coffee cups sat on a dusty shelf. A coat hung on a peg by the door. And on the floor, stacked in milk crates, were dozens of black, cloth-bound ledgers. Each one was dated. Each one filled with handwritten records. They were not financial in the traditional sense. There were no balance sheets, no taxes, no receipts. Instead, the ledgers appeared to track entries, people, times, and amounts. Some notations included names, some only initials. Some had amounts of money listed next to them. $50, $200, $600, and odd phrases like North Stairwell or cargo hold. The ledger spanned over a decade, but one, marked in red ink as March 1994, stood out. The entries for the 22nd began in the early afternoon. Nothing out of the ordinary. Scattered names, vague descriptions. Then, near the bottom of the page, P. Mallory, $400, side entrance, March 22nd. That was it. No exit time. No destination. No follow-up. The police were called immediately. The ledger was taken into evidence. Within days, Fingerprint analysis confirmed that multiple people had handled the book, but most were degraded or partial. No match to Peter Mallory was found. Still, the discovery changed everything. The name matched, the date matched, and the dollar amount, $400, matched the amount of cash Peter had withdrawn days earlier for his trip, documented by his bank. The question was, why had he gone into the factory? And with whom? When Claire was shown the ledger entry, she covered her mouth. He never carried large amounts of cash, she whispered, unless he was planning to pay someone. But who? The factory had no operational ties to the station. It had been listed as dormant since 1987, yet the interior showed signs of activity at least through the mid-90s. Someone had used that room, used those ledgers, recorded those names. Had Peter stumbled into something? Had he been offered a ride? A job? Had he seen something he shouldn't have? Investigators began to consider a chilling possibility, that Peter Mallory's disappearance wasn't a random accident or breakdown. That night in 1994, after missing his train, he may have crossed a line into a world operating quietly just beyond the edges of the law, and he never came back. Detective Alan Wren had reviewed dozens of cold cases during his 21 years in law enforcement, but there was something about the Peter Mallory file that stayed with him. A man who didn't drink, didn't gamble, didn't disappear for the thrill of it. A man who had done everything right until one train schedule shifted by 13 minutes, and he simply vanished. Now, nearly 3 decades later, his name had surfaced in a ledger pulled from a sealed room in a factory no one had entered since the early Clinton administration. Wren drove out to the site personally. The factory loomed over the tree line like a rusted skeleton, its smokestacks long dead, and its windows cloudy with dirt and time. The interior had been gutted in some places, but the second floor, where the hidden room was found, remained intact. The room was now cordoned off with plastic sheets and crime scene tape. Inside, time had frozen. The desk drawers held receipt books, key tags, rubber stamps, and pencils worn down to nubs. On the shelf were 2 narrow black phones, one disconnected, one without a cord. A corkboard on the wall bore scraps of paper pinned in a haphazard grid. Most were blank. One, however, had a number, Rail 22B, scribbled in faded red marker. Wren photographed everything. Then he opened the March 1994 ledger again and studied the line. P. Mallory, $400, side entrance, March 22nd. There was no indication of time, but other entries on the same page mentioned hours. 3:15 for 40, 7:05. Only Peters had none. That struck Wren as deliberate. He asked the forensics team to scan the wall adjacent to the desk. One of the techs noted a discrepancy in density behind the plaster. When they removed the panel, they uncovered a hollow compartment, roughly the size of a suitcase. Inside, wrapped in a mildewed canvas satchel, were 3 more ledgers, these unmarked on the outside. But when opened, the truth came closer. They weren't ledgers. They were logs. Shift reports, detailed descriptions of entries and exits, records of transactions, some coded, some blunt. A pattern emerged. From 1989 through 1994, the factory had served as a kind of waypoint. Names rotated, but several reappeared across the months. D. Kramer, S. Bell, A.R. Torres. Next to some of them were phrases like drop confirmed, no show, or reassigned to stairwell. And then, on the last page of the last book, in a tighter, more frantic hand, P. Mallory spoke briefly, said he was stranded, took offer, logged entrance, awaiting second contact. Then lights went dead. That was it. No date, but it was the only entry in the book that included a full sentence. Someone had spoken to him. Someone had made him an offer. The second contact never came. Wren contacted the company that had purchased the building. Through their permits, he traced ownership back to 1985. Before that, the factory had sat dormant. But from 1985 to 1995, it was owned by a holding company called Bridge Hall Consolidated, registered in Delaware, with no office, no employees, and no paper trail. A shell. Whatever had taken place inside those walls wasn't part of any known business. Wren pulled archive property records, business licenses, and local zoning variances. Most were vague, citing warehouse storage and seasonal use. But one request from 1992 caught his eye, a renovation permit for the East Side loading dock, signed by S. Bell. That name appeared 5 times in the recovered logs. Wren began searching for anyone connected to that name who had worked in logistics or transport during the early 1990s. Eventually, he found her, Sylvia Bell, now 71, living in a retirement community in Missouri. She had worked for a regional freight broker in the 90s before abruptly leaving the industry in 1995. Wren flew out and asked if she would speak on background. She agreed, cautiously. When shown a photograph of Peter Mallory and the factory building, she went quiet. Then, in a low voice, she said, "I knew something would come back." According to Sylvia, Bridge Hall was never a real company. It was a name used to move people, quietly, sometimes across town, sometimes across state lines. It wasn't human trafficking, not in the traditional sense. It was more like a courier system for those who wanted to disappear. People who paid to become invisible. Gamblers, drifters, people leaving debts or danger behind. You paid cash, she said, and someone would meet you. Sometimes they gave you a name, sometimes they didn't. You didn't ask. Wren pressed further. Did anyone ever come through who wasn't supposed to? She hesitated. Once. A man who missed a train. I only heard about it later. Said he wandered up to the side door and knocked. One of the guys on rotation logged him. He wasn't scheduled. Peter Mallory. Do you remember what happened to him? She looked away. No, and I don't want to. Wren returned to Illinois with more than he'd bargained for. Now the picture had changed. Peter Mallory hadn't just vanished. He'd stumbled into something he didn't understand, something meant to stay hidden, and someone had let him in. The term "took offer" echoed in Wren's mind. Had Peter accepted a ride, a job, an escape? Or had he been mistaken for someone else entirely? The logs held no further entries under his name. No notes, no strike-throughs. Just that one line. A dead end. But there was one more clue. A handwritten map found inside the second ledger. It showed the factory floor, the known rooms, and a square marked intake chamber circled in pencil. Wren returned to the site. The map matched, almost, but the intake chamber had never been found. It wasn't on any blueprint, wasn't visible inside the building, until a demolition worker, pulling down ceiling panels near the freight elevator shaft, found a loose panel. Behind it was a narrow passage, and at the end of that passage, down a metal stairwell, was a locked hatch door, rusty, unmarked, sealed from the inside. Detective Alan Wren stood before the hatch with a quiet tension settling over the room. The narrow stairwell smelled of rust and mildew, and the air was cool, far too cool for a building sealed for nearly 30 years. The hatch was flush with the concrete wall, painted gray to match, and sealed with an old mechanical deadbolt from the inside. There was no handle, no label. They had found the so-called intake chamber. A fire crew was brought in to assist. The metal was cut carefully to preserve the surrounding material. When the hatch finally gave way with a groaning metallic crack, the stale air that escaped carried with it the scent of paper, oil, and something less identifiable, like scorched wood and cold iron. What lay beyond was a room perhaps 12 feet square, windowless, with exposed ceiling beams and thick rubberized walls. There was a single cot against the far wall, a metal locker, a folding chair, and a table. On that table sat a black rotary phone, disconnected, and a tape recorder, old, heavy, and covered in dust. Next to it lay a cassette labeled only with the number 94 to 22. Wren froze when he saw the number. March 22nd, 1994. The date Peter Mallory disappeared. The tape was taken into evidence and reviewed that same night at the lab. The quality was degraded, warped by time and temperature, but after calibration, it yielded roughly 4 minutes of audio. The voices were quiet at first, then clearer. Male voice 1 said he was just trying to get home. Missed a train. Male voice 2, what did he say his name was? Male voice 1 didn't at first, just kept asking about a taxi. Said he'd pay. Male voice 2, for 100? Male voice 1, in cash? Said he had no ID. Didn't want to stay outside. Then silence. Then the sound of the door creaking. Male voice 1, we log him. Male voice 2, P. Mallory. Side entrance, 22 March. Male voice 1, and now? Male voice 2, lower. Now we wait. The tape cut out there. Wren sat in silence for a long time after the playback stopped. The tape was authentic. It confirmed Peter's presence in the factory that night, and that someone had recorded the exchange. He requested a full forensic sweep of the intake chamber. Inside the locker, they found a small stack of papers sealed in a plastic sleeve. Most were blank forms, release waivers, aliases, intake sheets, all designed to anonymize a person. But wedged between the forms was a folded envelope. No name, no address, only the word hold written on the flap. Inside was a wallet. It contained $200 in old bills and a driver's license. Peter Mallory, issued 1989, expired 1995. The last thing Peter was confirmed to have had on him, and now recovered, untouched, sealed in a place no one was supposed to find. What happened next was pieced together slowly. It's believed that after missing his train, Peter had wandered from the station, walking east toward the old freight yard. He may have seen light in the factory or a vehicle parked near the loading dock. He approached, knocked, spoke to someone. They offered him something. A ride? A job? A place to wait? Whatever it was, Peter agreed. He entered the factory, was logged in, his name written, his cash accepted. And from there, he was moved to the intake chamber. What happened inside, no one knows for sure. No remains are found. No blood. No struggle. Just the wallet, the tape, and Peter's name, written in a system not meant for outsiders. But then came another surprise. An additional tape, unlabeled, was found beneath a loose floorboard during continued search. This one was shorter, just over a minute. The voices were faint and strained. But one line, clearly spoken by a third, unknown voice, stood out. Male voice 3, he doesn't belong here. He thinks it's just a shelter. Male voice 2, does it matter? Male voice 3, it will. The tape ended abruptly. Forensic linguists couldn't confirm the voices' identities, but the tone was clinical, methodical. It implied intent. That Peter had been mistaken for someone else. That he had entered a system that didn't accept wrong answers. Wren followed up on every lead he could. Bridge Hall Consolidated had no paper trail past 1995. All P.O. boxes were closed. No tax records. No bank history. The factory itself had been sold and resold 4 times through cutouts and shell corporations. It was a phantom operation, but its purpose was clearer now. Not a business, not a shelter, a funnel, a way to erase people, either by their own request or by design. Peter Mallory was never supposed to be part of it. He was the wrong name, the wrong moment, the wrong knock on a door no one should have found. The final report filed by Wren summarized evidence. Physical confirmation of Peter Mallory's presence inside the factory on March 22, 1994. Audio tapes confirming verbal mention of his name and financial exchange. Recovery of his wallet from a hidden intake chamber. Ledger entry dated with matching time and dollar amount. The case status was updated. Missing person, located, presumed deceased. Peter's wife, Claire, now in her 70s, received his personal effects in a sealed envelope. She held the license in her hand and stared at it a long time. I always knew he wouldn't have run, she said softly. And now she knew he hadn't. The system meant to keep Peter hidden for good had left behind a crack, just enough to let the light back in. By early autumn of 2022, the investigation into Peter Mallory's disappearance had shifted from a mystery into something stranger, darker. The more Detective Alan Wren and his team uncovered about the old factory near Elbridge Station, the more it seemed like the building had operated in an entirely separate reality from the rest of the quiet Illinois town. It wasn't just the intake chamber. As engineers continued scanning the structure, they located 2 more concealed rooms, each hidden behind false walls, soundproof, and completely undocumented in the building's official blueprints. One of them, located on the first floor near what used to be a cargo bay, held several iron lockers and a cot. The other, smaller and more tightly sealed, contained only one item, a locked metal cabinet bolted to the floor. It took nearly 45 minutes to open the cabinet. Inside were rows of cassette tapes, unlabeled, stacked in molded foam slots. Most were degraded beyond recognition, but a few, including two dated March '94, were still intact. One of them included a second reference to P. Mallory, mentioned only briefly in a grainy conversation. He wasn't scheduled, but he paid. $400. Doesn't matter. Protocol's the same. You wait, then you clear. The term clear raised immediate questions. It was used across multiple tapes, often without context, sometimes in relation to people, sometimes to rooms. In a tape call from 1992, a voice said, "Two stayed past their window. I'm clearing both." The word felt clinical, intentional, like part of a process. When Wren presented this to a retired federal investigator who had consulted on organized crime cases in the late 80s, he received a response that chilled him. This wasn't a trafficking operation, the man said. It was something else, something quieter. Think of it like this. What if there was a place where people went to stop being who they were, but once they entered, the system didn't always know what to do with them? Wren asked, "What happens when someone enters by mistake?" The man said, "They become a problem to solve." At that point, the investigation pivoted from tracing Peter's physical movements to reconstructing his psychological state at the moment he vanished. Claire Mallory, during her third interview, recalled one detail she hadn't shared before. He said he didn't feel well, she remembered. That night, on the phone, just before hanging up, he said, "Everything feels off tonight." And then he laughed like he was embarrassed for saying it. That stuck with me. That sentence found its way into Wren's final report. But there was still more buried beneath the surface. An anonymous tip came into the police tip line in late November, via a letter, postmarked from Kansas City. The envelope contained a single printed page. No handwriting. No signature. Just a message. Check utility box 48 behind the signal tower. Mallory was never meant to stay. The utility box was located behind the old station's now-abandoned signal tower, overgrown with weeds. It had been disconnected from the power grid for years. When Wren arrived on site with an officer and a city maintenance key, they opened the box and found a small metal container duct-taped to the interior. Inside, a photograph. It was black and white, time-worn, showing Peter Mallory in what appeared to be the intake chamber, sitting at the edge of the metal cot, his hands folded, eyes cast downward. A single light bulb hung above him. No one else appeared in the frame. Written on the back, in block lettering, 20 minutes after arrival. The image had never been seen by Claire, by authorities, by anyone. Its existence meant only one thing. Someone else had been there. Someone with access to the chamber, to a camera, and to the larger operation. Wren pushed to reopen investigation lines into Bridge Hall Consolidated. He petitioned for the release of sealed transportation records and private security licensing from the 1980s and early 90s, hoping to identify anyone tied to shell companies in the Elbridge region. That's when the name Arthur R. Torres surfaced. Torres had appeared 3 times in the recovered logs from the intake chamber, his name always attached to the word check-in. When traced through business filings, Torres was listed as a consultant for a security services provider called Fenwick Solutions, another now-defunct entity registered in Nevada. But the trail didn't stop there. Torres had died in 2011, but his personal files, collected posthumously during a bankruptcy audit, were archived by an estate firm. Among them, a briefcase containing typed pages from the early 1990s detailing standard procedure for processing transit assets. The language was vague, sterile, but one passage stood out. Unscheduled entries to be retained until matched or redirected. In case of misassignment, internal containment protocol applies. Retain identity materials until status is cleared or voided. The language mirrored the phrasing from the tapes. Cleared, voided, retained. Peter Mallory hadn't just walked into a building. He had entered a machine, one designed to process, isolate, and remove identities from circulation. His wallet held, his name logged, his last moment photographed. There was no documentation suggesting he was ever matched to any scheduled movement or job, which meant, as far as the system was concerned, he never left. Claire Mallory, presented with a photo recovered from the utility box, stared at it for a long time. "He looks like he was waiting for someone," she said quietly, like he thought someone was coming to help. In December 2022, the case was closed administratively. No evidence of homicide, but all signs pointing to a system of disappearance Peter had fallen into by mistake. No charges could be filed. No suspects named. Too much time had passed. And yet, in Elbridge, something had shifted. For decades, the story of Peter Mallory had been a ghost story, a mystery whispered near train tracks and among late-night radio callers. But now, a ledger, a voice, a photograph, each piece brought him back into focus. And though he never returned home, Peter's name was finally written down in a place that mattered, the record, not just as a man who vanished, but as a man who was found, where no one thought to look. The snow fell light and silent over Elbridge as the year turned to 2023. Detective Alan Wren, now in the final months before retirement, made one last visit to the site of the old factory. The new owners had resumed renovation on the outer structure, but the second floor, especially the former intake chamber, remained untouched, cordoned off with warning signs and forensic seals. Inside, dust still hung in the air, disturbed only by the boots of investigators and the slow breathing of time. The cot was gone, the table removed, the locker emptied, but the walls remained. The bolts, the soundproofing, the memory. Peter Mallory had waited here. A man who simply missed a train. Wren stepped to the center of the room and looked at the spot where Peter's wallet had been found. He reached into his coat and removed a small laminated photo, Peter's driver's license image, copied and preserved. He left it there, leaned against the base of the far wall, just beside a rusted screw, a quiet acknowledgement. Not a grave, not a shrine, but something. That spring, the town council of Elbridge announced a new initiative, a public archive to document local unsolved cases. In the basement of the city library, a room was designated for exhibits related to unresolved disappearances, cold files, and strange history. It would be open to the public, with rotating materials. Peter Mallory's case would be the first. The display was modest. A copy of the ledger page from March 22, 1994. A replica of the intake chamber map. A brief audio clip of the tape, where his name was spoken, and a printed excerpt from the final investigation report, which read, Peter Mallory was not lost. He was recorded, logged, received. The system simply had no way to release him. That sentence stayed with visitors. It spoke to the quiet machinery of forgotten places, of people caught in gears they didn't know existed. It made Peter more than a case file. It made him real. Claire Mallory, after years of silence, gave a short statement to a local paper. I always believed Peter would have come home if he could, and now I know he tried. That's enough. She donated one item to the exhibit, a note Peter had left on the fridge the morning of his disappearance. It read, Train's running a few minutes late. I'll call before I board. Love you. Simple. Ordinary. The beginning of a journey no one expected to end the way it did. In the following months, more anonymous letters trickled into Wren's office. Most were vague, some clearly hoaxes, but one stood out. It was postmarked from Portland, Oregon, and contained only a single line. The system is dormant now, but it never shut down. No return address, no signature. Wren didn't pursue it. He had seen enough, read enough, heard enough to understand that some systems outlast even their architects. The one Peter stumbled into might be buried, but it had left traces, names and ledgers, voices on tape, walls that remembered what people forgot. And now, someone else remembered too. In the final days before demolition crews sealed the intake chamber permanently, one worker, tasked with photographing the area for documentation, noticed something odd etched into the back of a steel beam behind where the cot had once stood. At first, it looked like scratches, but under light, the letters became clearer. They read, "I am still Peter." The handwriting was faint, hesitant, but deliberate, likely scratched with a coin or maybe a key. It was the last mark he made. The worker took a photo before covering it up. That image was later printed and added to the Elbridge archive, not to shock, not to dramatize, but to remind. Peter Mallory had not chosen to disappear. He had knocked on the wrong door, trusted the wrong system, entered a machine that didn't know what to do with someone who didn't fit. And still, even after the ledger, the tapes, the photo, one thing mattered most. He remembered who he was,